Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey guys, welcome back to the show. Got a great episode for you today to kick off the week. We are speaking with Dr. Sean McFate. He is the author of The New Rules of War. He is a professor at the National Defense University. He also teaches at Georgetown as well too. His book is all about this idea that conventional war no longer works as a strategy for accomplishing political and military objectives. He wrote this book back in 2019, but with over a month into the Ukraine conflict, it's very clear that we need to call into question all sorts of things around how war actually operates now, whether or not Russia's conventional strategy was ever up to the task of accomplishing anything here. So many great things. I know you're going to love this episode. Let's get into this. Dr. Sean McFate, welcome to the Realignment.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
I was just telling you before the episode, I've done a lot of books for this series, and The New Rules of War has been incredible. And I just really want to recommend this to listeners. I know we're moving a lot of books during this series. This would pretty much be towards the top of my recommendation list, especially because you've balanced the length to insight ratio, which I know in this foreign policy defense space is a difficult one to maintain. So I think that's probably the side of you who also writes novels as well too. So that's my opening compliment to you.
Thank you.
So let's start with something I kept thinking about in the first chapter of the book. You're really telling the story of how the United States specifically just cannot win wars post World War II. Korea stalemate, Vietnam, we all know how that goes. Iraq, Desert Storm, all these things. It's complicated, but these are just not traditional battlefield victories that compare favorably with how World War II was decisively settled. My reaction, though, to a month into the Ukraine conflict is, here's my pushback. I don't think anyone knows how to win wars right now. The Chinese can't beat Vietnam in 1979. The Russians are struggling in Ukraine, obviously. The Russians are struggling broadly, even Chechnya in of itself is complicated. So can you just reflect on that idea that maybe it's not just the US that has the inability to do this, but actually it turns out that this specific post-World War II style of conflict is not suited for any great power?
Yeah, so it's a good question, Marshall. I mean, I think that, well, first of all, what started this book for me is that I was angry. Like a lot of your listeners, I, know friends who died in Iraq and Afghanistan, and, seeing tons of taxpayer money blown in those places, I mean, trillions of dollars. And as a US vet, it's hateful to see our international image tarnished by low-level foes like the Taliban and ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And but we have the best military in the world. I mean, even our adversaries know this. So why haven't we won a war since 1945? And this is the central question of the book. And I try to answer it. And I try to explain, here are 10 ways we can win future wars. It's true that great powers have not won wars. I mean, as you said, whether it's, France and Algeria under China, the Soviets in Afghanistan, Israel in Lebanon in 2006 against Hezbollah, the US, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. But not all of this is not always the case. I mean, so I talk about why that is, and you're right. But Russia did really well in 2014, the first time they went into Ukraine. They really stole it. And they didn't do it using conventional war. And, one of the mistakes they're making now, they're making colossal mistakes, which is another question. Why is Putin making these big mistakes? Is that they're using conventional warfare. And conventional warfare, it's from a particular time and place. It's not universal and timeless. It has a beginning, middle, and end. And, fighting conventional warfare as he's doing in Ukraine would be like trying to use Napoleonic horse tactics in 1914. I mean,
Can I pause you there real quick? Because I want to make sure your insights to minute are very high, but I want to make sure we capture it. You specifically said conventional war has a beginning, a middle, and an end. What did you mean by that specific statement?
So conventional war, when we think of conventional war, we think of, state on state warfare, military on military, uniform on uniform. nominally abiding by the laws of armed conflict or the norms of armed conflict. And victory looks like, you kill or capture more enemy, you take more of their territory, and you wave their flag over their captured capital. It's the warfare of Clausewitz. It's the warfare of World War II, which is why we love it. And it's also, when Americans think about war, it's that type of warfare. I mean, every year, Hollywood pumps up yet another movie about World War II. It just more, there's more World War II movies than all the other US war movies combined, even though that took place, 80 years ago. Why is that? Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, which really romanticizes it. It's not really, there are some movies that get really gritty about it, but they're fairly rare. So it is our paradigm of warfare. Now, the beginning of conventional war is really Napoleon in 1800. The middle is the Crimean War, arguably the Civil War in America, and the end was World War II. Since then, conventional wars have been exceedingly rare, and most of them happen, you can count them on maybe 2, maybe 3 hands. And most of them happen like in the 40 years ago or earlier. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is the first conventional war since the 1980s, since Iraq, Iran, since the Falklands, since arguably Gulf Storm 1 or the Desert Storm 1. But nobody fights conventionally anymore because it's the loser's game. And, we're seeing this in Ukraine play out as we speak.
And what's so interesting here is you kind of answered the question of why is Putin making these mistakes, because what you're essentially arguing, you argue this in the book, is that World War II has captured the imaginations of American strategic planners, senior military leaders. But World War II has also captured Putin's mind as well too. That's trying to get Kyiv in 3 days. That's, you're a former paratrooper yourself. That's dropping paratroopers in this very, let's just say, if this is the movie version of this conflict and Russia wins, it's great. If it's real life where you're dropping paratroopers without actual mechanized backup, it's a slaughter. And it's a disaster. So can you speak to that World War II and even the Russian, because I think this is the first time we're seeing this syndrome so vividly affect another country.
Yeah. Well, remember that, we in the West are paradigm prisoners of World War II, of conventional war. I mean, there's a saying that, generals always fight the last war, especially if they won it. And for both the US and NATO, well, Western NATO and Russia, that war is 1945. I mean, Russia hasn't really won a large war since 1945. And they had, the Soviet-Afghan War, which is like our Vietnam War, as well as them collapsing in on themselves. So I think what we're seeing here is the glory days. And as Putin becomes more a fixture of power in Russia, it's hard to know where his ego ends and Russian national security strategy begins. And I think some of his underlings are also having this problem. And I think that there is potentially the glory days. We're going to reunite Ukraine. They're going to greet us as liberators. They're going to greet us like the Anschluss. They're going to greet us like Crimea did in 2014. And of course, it ignores the fact that right after World War II, there was a Ukrainian insurgency against the Soviets that the Soviets brutally put down. That, during the Cold War, this Hungary 1956, Czechoslovakia 1968, where there were these uprisings that the Soviets brutally put down. And this image of a cohesive Russian empire that Putin may have in his mind, the one he's trying to resurrect, is more fiction than fact, which we can discuss. But I think his miscalculations this past, month have been really befuddling for many Putin watchers, myself one of them. Like, why would somebody who has such a clever track record blow it so big? Maybe he'll come out on top, but I don't think so. I think he's really he's committed some significant and rookie errors that it's just strange. But I think he has this conventional war syndrome as well.
And what's interesting here, and because I want to get to this very specific idea, we'll get to some of your strategies for winning wars, but an idea I, as a civilian interested in military affairs, am very interested in is the difference between military victory and political victory. Because I think this is something that oftentimes civilians just aren't generally aware of. So you'll say folks say things like, well, why couldn't we just win in Iraq the second time? Right. Why are we unable to win wars again? Well, my answer to the World War II question is in World War II, we were perfectly positioned because our military objectives were perfectly suited with our political objectives in terms of how achievable they were. Political objective, crush Nazi Germany and Japan with unconditional surrender. Well, you can achieve that with the nuclear bomb, with the Soviets coming from the East, the US and the Allies coming from the West, perfectly suited. Iraq, military objective, kill as many insurgents as possible, defeat the Iraqi army, remove Saddam Hussein from power. That is different than the political objective of constituting a new Iraq that's aligned towards the West. So can you just speak to this? Because I think this is my best defense of the military, quote unquote, which is that the political leaders have given them politically impossible tasks that no matter what strategy you use is going to end in failure.
Yeah. So it's a good question, and it's something I address in the very beginning of the book is what does victory look like? Because if you don't know what victory looks like, how can you create a strategy to achieve it? And frankly, in my opinion, we don't have strategic thinkers in our generation, at least not in positions of power in a Democratic or Republican Party. We have sycophants, but not strategists. And this is why one reason we continue to lose against low-level foes. What happens? We have to go against a high-level foe, like China or Russia, right? I mean, we'll get to the Russian-Ukraine war, at this moment, but let's step back for a bit. So we have forgotten what war is about and how to achieve victory. We suffer from what I call the tacticization of strategy, right? And what this means is that war has three levels to it. At the think of it as a pyramid. At the base, you have the tactical level. That's the platoon leader, the Arleigh Craft, the Arleigh Burke destroyer. That's at like the individual fighting level. Platoons and companies, and then the operational level. You have military campaigns. Or you have unified commands. And then at the strategic level for the US, that's everything. And, what is war? War is armed politics. That's what war is. It's armed politics. Now, everybody's said it for eons. It's not just something that Clausewitz invented with, war is the instrument of politics by other means, or he says policy, but the word for politics and policy are the same in Old German. Sun Tzu said this in the very first line of The Art of War 2,500 years ago. This is not a unique and new idea. What this means is that if you want to have victory in war, you have to win both the armed and the politics part. And, there's no such thing as winning just the armed, but losing the politics. If that happens, you've lost strategically. So this is the myth of bifurcated victory. So this is something that, General Westmoreland after Vietnam, he was the Sink of Vietnam, said, we won every battle. He said we won every battle out there. He didn't say, we didn't win the war, but we won every battle. So that's somehow we neither won nor lost, but that's wrong. If you don't achieve both, then you've lost the war, to be blunt about it. And that victory at the strategic level, the military victory only makes sense in a political context. So if you don't have that, whether it's, it's Iraq or Vietnam or the Soviets in Afghanistan or whatever. I mean, there's no such thing as bifurcated victory. There's no such thing as we won every battle, but we lost the war. And this is how David beats Goliath, is that they know this and they win the political fight. and they also like draw a power like the US or the Soviets into battlefield areas that are really irrelevant for the political victory, so that we waste ourselves there. So, one of the problems like we have is, like, I like to say that there were two wars in Afghanistan. We won the first but lost the second. The first was in the months and weeks after 9/11, was to go in there and push Al-Qaeda out, which we did by December. That was a victory. We achieved our political ends, but then we decided to stick around and make Afghanistan a 51st state, which is hubris that you can do that. And second, that, leave it to the US, Washington, D.C. to sort of lay out a military objective that cannot be taken by the military alone, right? I mean, that's why it failed. They laid out objectives that were essentially political and then set out with a military campaign to achieve it. Some have called this, counterinsurgency later on, but that failed. We can talk about why COIN was a big failure and was doomed to fail, frankly, because of lack of strategic thinking. But the point about victory today and the point about Russia and Ukraine today is that Russia needs not just an armed win, it needs a political win. And I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, no, I love that summary because it more eloquently sums up why, and this is just terrible to say, considering how bad things are in Ukraine right now, but why I'm optimistic long term, because by the metrics you just established, Putin has lost already, in the sense that conventional war was his tool for destroying Ukrainian national identity and subverting it to Russia and cowing the West. But with the second that he couldn't make it to Kyiv in 5 days, he lost on all of those counts. So that's why this is why it's complicated to talk about, especially when the fighting continues. But it's just, I think this is a new frame of reference for folks, because once again, this is different than the World War II image that we think about. Something I want to get to, and this is going to seem kind of random, but this is the part that feels most relevant to the Ukrainian context, because now what we're discussing is, what is Putin doing since his first 5 days? Storming Berlin, plan basically did not work. So I really wish I'd read this book in 2019 and not after the conflict, because this was your most prescient point, I think. We should essentially, this isn't a direct quote, you basically point out our assumption that nuclear weapons are off the table is just completely invalid. Whether or not they're used or not, you are just pointing out that we should not be shocked that Putin is just throwing around those terms and basically making clear that they conceive of a nuclear weapon, especially a tactical one, as essentially just a bigger bomb. So can you just speak to this part? Because I think this has been what's been toughest to think about the past month.
Yeah. So the book, The New Rules of War, sort of really leans into our groupthink and really presses our paradigms about what we think is strategy in the future of war. What is war? And one of the things I talk about is like, look, why do we assume the nuclear taboo will last through our lifetimes? I mean, the fact that it's held up since 1945, since Hiroshima, is rather miraculous. And I can see, if we think of war as armed politics, there's not a more political arm out there than a nuke. And even, and I can see a scenario where, Putin doesn't even have to use it in Ukraine. He can blow one up in Siberia. It would shake the world, right? At the strategic level of war, it's all armed politics. And that would be a very political move with almost no tactical utility, but the strategic level would blow people away metaphorically.
And this is the question I want to, you're not a nuclear strategist. We're doing an episode on this next week, but I want to know your answer to this question. What is the response to the Russian argument that a tactical nuke is essentially just a piece of artillery, right? If you think about it, right? Like the firebombing of Tokyo killed far more people than, and obviously there's a norm against like flame, that style warfare now, but like it still is different. If Putin tested his new big napalm attack, that would not have the political effect that you pointed out with the nuke. So what is our risk? Why shouldn't we just? I mean, I know why we shouldn't on a personal level, but what is the Western response to the no tactical nuke is just big artillery?
Well, we used to have tactical nukes in West Germany before the Cold War ended. I mean, I think that if we look at this like critical thinkers, there is no difference. I mean, nuclear weapons, unless you want to pancake a city, the nuclear weapons, we have conventional munitions that could do anything a nuclear weapon could do just about. Maybe bombing Natanz or something might be a different thing at the Iran, the underground Iran nuclear lab. Maybe you need a tactical nuke for that. But by and large, it's a big bomb. Your future scientists can explain, how clean they are. I think they're fairly clean. It's not like radiation. It's like we're not going to see Godzilla coming out of Bikini Island attacking Tokyo. I could be wrong on that. But we have just in international relations a nuclear taboo and stigma associated with things like a World War III Armageddon scenario, like the Cuban Missile Crisis of 62, or Able Archer in 1983, where we came kind of close to a nuclear war, whether Americans know that or not, something, the Russians remember very well. But I think it's largely a construction in our mind about tactical nukes, especially that it's just a bigger bomb. This is what MacArthur said in Korea before he got fired. He's not exactly wrong with these things. But the US, I think, we don't have a first strike policy. And I think I think it's something America will uphold going forward. It doesn't mean that China or Israel or, Russia and other holder or Pakistan won't do it. And so we can't be naive to the possibility of nuclear war in our lifetime.
Another topic I'd like to get to, and this is honestly, as someone who spent a lot of time in DC think tank land and kind of does this for a living, I was actually laughing at how visceral your aggression towards future of war people is. Yeah. People who are describing Iron Man exoskeletons, quasi-magical hacking. I think you said when you watch, I can't remember what movie you were referencing, but you said if you watch a lot of these shows, someone will be a hacker and they turn into a god in terms of what they can accomplish with a few keystrokes. So just go on for as long as you need to go on this, because I think it's because seriously, because A, it's funny, but and we need something semi-lighthearted here. Well, but B, it just gets to how this isn't quite a future of war episode, because I want to make clear this isn't a talk to that, please.
I mean, the book really is a sort of a future of war book. Actually, it only looks like the future because we're so stuck behind in the past. We have like the Maginot mentality about warfare. We're fixated in the last war, and that leaves us blind to the future. I mean, and there's all these war futurists at think tanks or, novelists or something of both. And their visions of the future are obsolete by 2 years later. I mean, think of Tom Clancy, right? I mean, when I was a cadet in the Army in the late 80s, we all had this book, Red Storm Rising, tucked into our arm like it was an oracle. In this book, it came out like 86, 87, Tom Clancy, which many people say may his name be praised, it's a book about like World War III, NATO versus Russia. And in this book, it's total confirmation bias. A desperate USSR launches a sneak attack against the West, and the US rallies NATO and leads us bravely, with honor to defeat the Soviet Union, and it's supposed to be all realistic. And of course, it's all bunk. I mean, first of all, there were no nuclear weapons in this World War III. It was like basically World War II.
So they launched conventional. So when you say
all conventional, there's nowhere the nukes, which is totally unrealistic. The second is that, when he was writing this in 87, 88, the Russians were no threat. They were busy imploding in Afghanistan. And we wondered, what was he basing this on except his own fantasy? Yet the military loved it, and so did the CIA. And this is why I really despise war futurists, is because they get people killed with their silly ideas. They steer our imagination space about what the future war is, and that leaves. And they're always fighting the last war and not the next. And the way you become a bestseller as a novelist, and I'll tell you because I've written 3 novels, is you shovel confirmation bias. That's what you do. You write and tell the Marine Corps what they want to hear, that you unanimously destroy your enemy, China, and the beaches of wherever. You always win. And that's not the type of servicing we need. We need to think, how do we fight real war where it's going to be ugly? And it may not look like World War II at all. In fact, it may not even look like war to a conventional warrior. And so the problem is that not only does this get people killed, it's a huge waste of money. We think that the future of war is going to be like against China, will be some sort of battle of Midway in the South China Sea with Ford-class carriers, F-35s, and drones. And that's absurd. I mean, battlefield victory could be obsolete. I mean, we all remember George Bush, W. Bush, on an aircraft carrier in 2003 saying mission accomplished, right? We achieved perfect battlefield victory over the Iraq military. It was inconsequential for the war. We are post-conventional war today. We are post-battlefield victory. So why do we need these super expensive weapon systems? Ford-class carriers cost $13 billion a pop, even before you add sailors or aircraft. The F-35 program costs $1.5 trillion, which is more than Russia's GDP on a single seat airplane with 0 combat kills, in the last 20 years of war, 0. So, and we're building more of them. So I just don't, this is all being driven by war futurists who persuade members of Congress, 4-stars, Hollywood, that this is the vision of war. It's like 1921 when some French movie company decides we're going to make a war about how the Maginot Line bravely pushes back a future German assault. Meanwhile, the Germans are creating the Blitzkrieg. That's where we are today. And that's why I'm so hard over on these futurists. They kill people.
Yeah. So 15 different things I want to pick up there. We're getting deep cut. We're getting to deep cuts with the Maginot Line references. So what was the Maginot Line? Like, what was it? So within your framework, how was the Maginot Line a response to the last war, that being World War I in France? And then what is our 2022 equivalent of the Maginot Line?
Well, so the Maginot, so I like to say that strategic thinking is critical thinking. There's no checklist for victory. There's no diagram, or, it takes it takes art. It's not a science. It takes art and intuition. And the lazy thinker, or the conventional thinker in this case, they assume that the future of war looks like the past successful one with better technology. And so for the French in 1919, that looked like big trench warfare. So what did they do? They put all of their resources in this super weapon called the Maginot Line, arguably the greatest military fortification system in history. And it was on the border of Germany and France in the interwar years. And it's a pretty amazing feat of construction. Even if you go there today, it's really amazing. It's like underground tunnels and encasements and these pop-up turrets along strategic valleys. And it's amazing. And the idea was, if the Germans were going to come again, like they did in 1914, we will stop them at the border and blow them to bits and convince them that attacking France is futile. And that's our strategy. Now, of course, we know how the story ends. Germany, which was a lot less well off than France during interwar years, they changed their way of warfare. And they created the Blitzkrieg, which wasn't just about technology. Americans love technology. It was about how the tactics, the leadership, everything, including technology. And they easily outflanked the Maginot Line. And what the Germans couldn't achieve in 4 bloody years of World War I, they achieved in just 6 weeks in World War II, and they seized Paris. Meanwhile, Parisian high command was in total cognitive dissonance. I mean, Eric Bloch, who's a famous historian and eyewitness to this, said, the French, their minds were too inelastic to comprehend what was happening to them as the German tanks were rushing down the boulevards. We have a Maginot Line today. We're basing our future, if you look at the Department of Defense's budget, I like to say that budgets are moral documents because they don't lie. If you look at DoD's budget, you can see where we're placing our bets for what kind of tools and weapons we need for the future of war. And if you every year they're pretty much the same. It's like F-35s, naval ships, armored carriers, rockets, artillery. They're all conventional war. That's what they're tooled to do. Yet we live in a post-conventional war era. And, our current Maginot Lines are like the F-35. All our money's going into this. We haven't fought a strategic dogfight since, the Korean War. Why do we need more fighter jet aircraft, especially manned ones? How do they get to be the size of, $1.5 trillion for a jet that we don't use in war? I'm an old, infantry grunt. We would say that dog don't hunt. It has got zero combat missions, at least not like real ones. I mean, destroying a weapons cache in 2018 in Afghanistan is not what that plane was designed to do. So we have a Maginot mentality. It's driven by war futurists, and it's extremely dangerous because right now, our enemies, our adversaries are waging, China and Russia could already be at war against us and we don't know it. And that's by their design because they have changed their way of warfare the same way that the Germans did in the interwar years of World War I and World War II.
So here's the question then. So what does good war futurism look like? Because as you made clear, so there's this huge body of work that goes into Blitzkrieg, right? So there's BFC Fuller, who's a Brit. There's Achtung Panzer, which is which basically just Panzer being tank. This is Heinz Guderian and the strategy behind it and everything like that. Basically, that was futurism in a way. That is saying, hey, here's how World War I went. You go into World War I thinking that the offensive is the best thing. It actually turns out the defense is the best thing. So the French maybe think that defense is the case this time, but actually there's this way that we could win offensively by changing, because the fact that tanks are slightly different, this or that, right? Combined arms, all that good stuff. That was effective war futurism, it seems. So
yeah.
And maybe the word is maybe not war. When you're saying war futurism, you seem to be describing a specific style of strategic thought about the future. So when we put aside that word, what would better thinking about the future look like?
Well, look, war futurism is a fine word. I mean, it's trying to understand what the future of war will look like and what we have to do now to get ready for it at the strategic, operational, tactical level. And let me tell you. And so, what does good future war futurism look like? Well, it doesn't look like a bestseller in the New York Times. It doesn't look like somebody's going to get a lot of play in Capitol Hill or in the think tank community. In fact, it's going to be somebody who's going to be ostracized. So let me give you an example of what a good war futurist look like so listeners understand, so they know it when they see it. Let's look at Billy Mitchell, for example. Now, Billy Mitchell, if you have Air Force guys and gals out, they know who he's. Now we see him as the founder of the U.S. Air Force. So Billy Mitchell was a war futurist, and all futurists have something called Cassandra's curse. Cassandra's curse. Some of you may remember from the Iliad, where Cassandra was this princess from ancient Greece, who the gods gave her the gift of prophecy, but the curse that nobody believed her. And all war futurists, from Billy Mitchell to J.C. Fuller to Andy's, they all suffer from Cassandra's curse. So that's the first thing. So let's look at Billy Mitchell as an example. So Billy Mitchell was a U.S. Army aviation fighter pilot in World War I. He fought, biplanes, and he came back as a 1-star to Washington, D.C. and told everybody what the future of war was going to be. He said, it's going to be air power. We have to get ready now. The future of war is going to be air power. And of course, they all had the Maginot mentality. And it's like, no, sit down, Billy. We all know the future of war is going to be, more trench line, static defense. We need to have encasements. We need to have all these other things. And he said, no, that doesn't matter. He says, it's going to be the airplane. Nobody took him seriously. Nobody.
One quick thing, specifically that an airplane could sink ships.
That's right.
That's the specific. Yeah.
And then he said, then he got really heretical. He said, okay, in the future, airplanes will sink battleships. And when he said this in 1920, the airplane was basically a motorized kite in the era of the super dreadnought. And so people laughed and howled at him, but Mitchell had some grit. And he convinced the Navy to pull out a captured German battleship from World War I into the Chesapeake, where airplanes sank it. Now, you would think that this would be proof of concept that air power, there's something to it. It's not just reconnaissance kites up there. But no, instead, the Navy completely denied it and used character assassination to discredit it. And they said, look, this is a PR stunt done by this uppity brigadier who's not even Navy guy. He tried to attack an unarmed at anchor battleship. It's not combat simulation. And and so they poo-pooed the entire thing. Mitchell's on the other side saying, no, I told you I can sink it with an airplane. That's proof of concept. Let's start from there. This debate got so heated and acrimonious that it spilled out of the War Department. This is pre-Pentagon. So the War Department's where the old executive building is today. And it spilled into congressional politics and into national media, like the Chicago Tribune and stuff like that. And then the acting sort of CGSC at the time, General Pershing.
CGSC.
He was General Pershing was sort of the head of the U.S. Armed Forces as the highest ranking general. He's like he's the highest ranking soldier, and he kind of pulled Mitchell aside. And maybe some of your listeners have had a speech like this. I got a speech like this when I was a second lieutenant. He's like, Mitchell, Billy, come over here. Take a seat, have a Coke. And he says, Billy, let's talk about your career. So he's like, I think we need to get you out of town for just a little while to let this debate simmer so we can have a more constructive discussion. And Billy Mitchell, of course, knows that this isn't, a request. And in typical Department of Defense fashion, they send Mitchell to the other side of the planet. They send him to the Pacific for a whole year to have him cool his jets. Now, Mitchell, he disappears as a one-star. Things kind of settle down. He comes back a year later with a report like 2 inches thick. In this report, he says, on a Sunday morning at 7:30 a.m., the Japanese will launch a sneak attack using airplanes against Pearl Harbor that will draw the U.S. and Japan into a total war for the Pacific. Mitchell predicts Pearl Harbor in 1924. Now what happens to Mitchell? Does the Department of Defense say, oh, let's think about what? No, they court-martial him. They court-martial him at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. And it's not just any court-martial. It's like a Kim Kardashian court-martial with paparazzi and tampered witnesses and corrupt judges, 3 of whom get thrown out. The jury, which has no aviators on it, finds Mitchell guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer, which you could drive anything, a truck through. And in frustration, Mitchell tears off his uniform, says, screw it. For the last few years, he goes around the country telling anybody who listened to him, the future of war is air power, the future of war is air power. Nobody took him seriously. Now, we know how this ends. Pearl Harbor happens. The U.S. military says it was caught completely by surprise by an unscrupulous enemy, even though one of its own generals was standing on desks 15 years before this saying what was going to happen. That is what a war futurist looks like. They're not embraced by the herd mentality. They are spit out by the herd mentality, because the military and national defense is a very strong cultural institution around defense. There is a saying from management expert Peter Drucker that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And our strategic culture around conventional war can eclipse our strategic IQ about what modern and future war already has become. And that's my concern. And that's why I wrote the book, New Rules of War.
So to sum everything up then, the central heretical thought here is that conventional war as a tool of politics is essentially over. It's a lesson that we should have learned post World War II. It's a lesson that the Russians, no matter how this turns out militarily, are learning actively right now. Even if you plant the Russian flag in Kyiv, that lesson still must be learned.
Well, let me finish up by saying,
yeah,
I'll tell you how Ukraine's going to end up. Russia is using conventional war the first time in 40 years anybody's tried it. It is failing. It is failing. He's going to go unconventional shortly. And what does Russian unconventional war look like? It's not winning hearts and minds coin. It's flattening cities like Grozny 2 or Aleppo. It's mass casualties. It's human rights abuse. So, the proof of the conventional war is dead is exactly what's going on in Ukraine, where you have an active resistance movement. So, they may own a few tanks, but they're getting all their kills using guerrilla tactics, javelins, and perhaps stingers. That is what I write about in this book 2 years ago, is that conventional war is dead. And if we can keep that insurgency alive cross-border in a NATO country, we can win because, basically, as Kissinger said 30, 40 years ago, the big army loses if it does not win. The guerrilla wins if it does not lose. If we can support a guerrilla movement against Putin, we deny him his victory condition, and that's a form of winning. It's a form of politically winning. He can win every battle, but we'll make him lose the war.
And I think what's particularly disconcerting if you're a Russian in the field right now is that, at least as it stands right now, it's not as if they're even winning every battle. So this isn't even Vietnam. This isn't even Iraq in 2005. I think that's the part where there's a whole other podcast about Russian military effectiveness that needs to basically be had here.
Yeah.
So something you said before the episode, and this is also too complicated to do the perfect background on, but basically you've pointed out that there's a real generational dichotomy to how folks have responded to your book. So if you basically said if you came into the army pre-Berlin Wall, hate this, you came in after 89, 90, you like it. Yeah. Explain that dichotomy, explain what you think is going on there.
Yeah, so first of all, when I wrote this book, I wrote it to be read. I didn't write an academic tome. I wanted so my mother could read it, who knows nothing about any of this, and that you could read it like in an airplane or an airport or someplace. I use some fiction writing skills. It's not fiction, but some of the tradecraft of writing, writing good writing, if you will. So that would be read, and it has been read, and it's done really well. Some places, and other places want to tie me to the stake and burn me alive. And some of it depends on, where they are. So people who love it are special operations forces like Green Berets and SEALs and Rangers and, called SOCOM. The CIA likes it a lot. The world they see looks like the world in this book. The U.S. Army is split between conventional thinkers who want more tanks and more artillery, like we're seeing used in Ukraine, and the other half of the military is like, no, I think what McFate's describing as the current, it's not just the future war, what's happening now looks pretty accurate. So let's take a look at his recommendations. The Marines love it. Now, the Marines and the Army are similar, that they're both ground forces and they both fight for the US flag. And you're wondering, why do we have a Marine Corps and an Army? And the bottom line is it's tradition. It's never going to go away. So, but the Marine Corps is punchy, and General Berger right now is a strategic thinker. He's willing to think beyond the paradigm, as are most Marines. And I think this is driven by the fact that the Marines, they are always thinking about the next fight in the way that the army doesn't have to, because the army is kind of like the big brother in some ways, and the Navy is, I mean, and so is the Navy, and the Marines are kind of, they got to be punchy, and they are punchy thinkers, and they're engaging this. And the Navy doesn't like it because they're into aircraft carriers and F-35s, and they want to have a battle of Midway against China in the Straits of Taiwan. The Air Force, I thought, would hate it because I really take the piss out of the F-35. And, they're split. So fighter jet pilots do not like the book because their whole world is about fighter jets. It's Top Gun for them. But everybody else in the Air Force tends to like it. Not everybody, but like refueling jet fire, the pilots who have the logistics or the refuelers, they like it. The intelligence loves those who just work the hangars. I mean, maintenance. I mean, the rest of the Air Force seems to really like it and get it, and which is an interesting split. The military industrial complex, the big oligarchies on the Beltway like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, they despise it. They despise this book because I say we're wasting our money on all these expensive high ticket items like aircraft carriers that don't win wars anymore. And so let's do other things. In fact, we need to win the information war. And that's not something that comes out of the Department of Defense. That comes out of other places. So they don't like me because I'm bad for their bottom line. But overall, I'll say this is that what I'm finding is that if you entered the military, whether it's the US military or the British military or the Malaysian military, if you entered the military after the Berlin Wall fell down in 1989, 1990, then you will like this book because it looks exactly like what warfare has been your adult life. Now, if you entered the military in the 80s, before the end of the Cold War, and you cut your teeth on the Cold War and you're sort of like imprinted on that, you're not going to like this book. It's going to look, it's going to look antithetical to you. I'm going to look like a heretic for assuming that we could use disinformation to win against the enemy, and that combat operations are not the most important thing in the world. And that's most of our 3- and 4-star generals today. But this generational shift is pushing up and out that generation. And I see a lot of senior leaders in the future who sort of get this or get all. They don't agree with everything I have to say, but they agree with more of it than not. And also this war in Ukraine is proving the 10 new rules of war. Zelensky and disinformation campaign, the St. Javelin sticker that we all love. I mean, that's doing a lot to rally political support around the world, which is the strategic level of war. So the war is not over in Ukraine. It is a new rules of war fight, even though it didn't start that way, but I believe it will end that way.
So 3 questions to wrap. So 1, earlier in the episode, you made reference to the fact that you don't have confidence in the modern political class's strategic leadership and just ability to think through these types of problems. So would love to, once again, you're not a political strategist here, so this isn't an election question. It's more just, where does good civilian strategic thinking come from? Because I'll just say something, not to be particularly edgy, but I think it's true. I'm not particularly impressed with many veterans who are in elected office either. So this isn't, you get kind of defensive as a civilian sometimes, but like I'm not gonna name names here, but like it's not at all clear that electing more vets from the war on terror is inherently going to solve the problem you're describing. So just what is your articulation of the problem and how do you solve it?
Well, look, I mean, the reason we don't win wars is because the answer is we have the best military. It's not the military that's the problem. At the tactical and operational levels of war, we are unbeatable. I mean, people sometimes say China, Russia, they could put up a fight. I don't think so.
Especially not now. Take nukes off the table
I just think
in Ukraine,
that people they over exaggerate the threat. I mean, we have the best military in the world. The problem is we lose at the strategic level of war. We have been since the Vietnam era, right? I mean, and that's because we have elected officials, who are not strict. They have zero strategic IQ. They've not since like Abraham Lincoln, who was a strategist. We've been more lucky than smart. I think George Marshall during World War II was a strategic thinker. But again, we got more lucky than smart. I think he was the greatest American general of the 20th century was George Marshall. So look, here's what I believe is that we should stop thinking that 4 stars means that you are automatically a strategic thinker. I think that I adopt like a Ratatouille rule. That movie Ratatouille, like the Disney movie with the rat who's in a kitchen in Paris. It's a good movie for those who have kids will have seen it. I would say this is that like Ratatouille, not everybody can be a good strategist, but a good strategist can come from anywhere. Mm-hmm. So let's try to figure out a way to identify, recruit and develop strategists. We don't do it in the armed forces very well. I teach I'm a faculty member at a war college. The war colleges have some really good professors, but institutionally, they're still stuck in the 20th century, what they teach. It's very Clausewitz heavy, very other things. But civilian universities are worse. If you take a graduate program at SAIS or someplace else, you're going to get a whole bunch of abstruse political theory of international relations, realism versus constructivism. And they think that's somehow strategic. It's not. It's just it's international relations theory. That's not strategy. And I'm a professor at Georgetown and Syracuse University. So I teach in the civilian side as well. So we need to think about how to create strategists. And one of my inspirations, and I don't know how to do this in reality, so maybe if one of your listeners can write me, I'm very inspired by one of my favorite books called Ender's Game.
I know you're
by Orson Scott Card. Yeah. So I'm not saying we should do that, but in this science fiction novel, they have it's like aliens versus the Earth, and they need strategic thinkers. They develop this program to like recruit children who have natural strategic genius, and they raise them to be strategic thinkers. And I'm not saying we should recruit from children, but I mean, we need a deliberative, some sort of path of education. And let's not invite muckety mucks who come in. Like, why do we need to have former generals or national security advisors and ambassadors? Did they ever win wars? Let's be honest here. Let's, say no. Maybe some of the best strategists are CEOs, or, it's not a one-to-one fit, but, or producers. I mean, look at Zelensky. His background is not in strategy. His background is he's a TV comedian, but look how he's weaponized his knowledge to win the information war against Russia, a disinformation superpower. So that's my point. We need to be a lot more open to what is it? How do you identify a strategic genius? And then how do we raise and foster them for the benefit of the world? So that's that. I haven't figured that out. That's what war college should be. It's not, but that's what we need.
And a quick follow-up on this, because I'm a huge Ender's Game fan. And the key thing is that whole in the future thing that Orson Scott Card could do is they can identify, like the battle school, the international fleet can identify these geniuses because they literally are plugged into everyone's heads. So like they're essentially able in a Deus Ex Machina way to know what these traits are. We can't do that. So how would you define what are these traits that folks are interested in? What traits should you cultivate if you are a leader in an institution such as the one you're describing? What should you be looking to identify beyond just like, oh, hey, he's a CEO, he can manage things? That's not what strategic genius means.
No, it doesn't. And not every CEO is a strategic thinker as well. We all know that, right? So, it's a great question, Marshall. I'm still working on it. I think critical thinking is the biggest thing. And I often, this surprises people, I say, liberal arts are really good because when you liberal arts like history and English, it teaches you to think through complexity and ambiguity. it's not like engineering. So like if you look at like West Point or Annapolis or Navy ROTC, they're all engineering programs, and that's a certain type of genius. You know, A leads to B, leads to C. But national security problems, war at the strategic level, it is not an engineering problem that can be reversed engineered or have a checklist for victory. You need to think through ambiguity, and you need to be comfortable with, frankly, operating through the fog of war. And I think that liberal arts and critical thinking is useful because when you read, like, say, Brothers Karamazov, which is a famous 19th century novel by Dostoevsky, it's a very thick book. And, it's not, you read it, it's not, you could read it for like, what is life like in 1880s Russia? But that's not the point. The point of the book is, what is love? What is God? What is your duty to family? And it makes you think through all these questions without answers. And that's what we need strategists to be: creative thinkers, critical thinkers, and ultimately cunning thinkers. Cunning. I'm a big Sun Tzu fan, not a big Clausewitz fan. He says war is all about strategic deception. How do you fake out and outwit your enemy? And I think we need more of that. Even though that we are Goliath, we need some David in us. And Americans can be very clever when they want to be, but we just, we're not very clever at the moment, at least not the strategic class of DC. I have no doubt we've got really good strategic thinkers below them, around the world, everywhere. But we don't have a system that rewards that identifies that puts them in positions of power. I mean, the National Security Council, the appointees there I think are frankly disgraceful in terms of what they do. I mean, like, the ones that come from the interagency, that's fine. They're the best and brightest, like DOD, but some of the ones they're just political favors for a presidential campaign. They walk into portfolios they have no idea about, and they're now running national security for the country, and we wonder why we can't beat the Taliban. So we need strategic thinkers. What the characteristics are is a great question, and have like listeners come and email me too, or email Marshall, because this is an open question for us all.
Yeah, Sean, would love to just wrap by you shouting the book. You've written several things, just please just shout your books out for anyone who's interested.
Well, I write fiction, nonfiction. So the book we've been talking about is called The New Rules of War. It answers, so how do we win against our adversaries? And it gives 10 new rules or ideas of war that will blow the conventional mind. The conventional warrior's mind will be blown open, and that's okay. But basically it's, how do we get cunning? We're already strong. How do we get cunning? And it's about, and so I think people will like it. You don't have to agree with everything, but I think you're going to, even if you are very conventional, you're going to put the book down, and I think you're going to be, I got to think some things through a bit. And, the book is meant to start a conversation and not end it. But my other books, I also write novels, and these are like Tom Clancy novels, but with like new rules of war stuff. So my last novel was called High Treason. It's been called Better Than Clancy by, if I can get a copy of it right here, James Patterson. At least says it's better than Clancy. It's a fun read. It's like, it's like 24, and it's good. I like to write both fiction and nonfiction. They're both amazing platforms to get one's ideas out.
Really well said. Sean, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Marshall. Anytime.